Master Your Mindset Radio, episode 42.
Welcome to Master Your Mindset Radio, the show where we empower you to conquer limiting beliefs and transform your world with your gifting and purpose. Now for your host, Elizabeth Nader.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. Thank you for being here. I want to talk to you about what I said last week. I brought you a very short podcast about hopelessness, and I think it was really important to consider that emotion and that sense of hopelessness is so prevalent out there in our world right now. But I also mentioned to you that I wasn't going to talk long about racism because there were so many voices. And I felt like we need to listen more than talk. So in that vein, I do today want to bring you the subject, but I want to bring it to you from the standpoint of listening to someone who lives with this subject, who moves in this area in her life, in her purpose, and her calling. And my prayer is that each of us will learn something today as we talk, as we explore, as we start to try to understand the area of racism in our world and in our country, because this conversation needs to stay where it is. It's not going away, and we need to find some healing. So I wanted to bring to you guys and to my community someone who I feel has a lot of value to give you in this arena, and we're just going to have a heart-to-heart conversation. We're going to ask questions, we're going to explore, we're going to see where it takes us. So everybody, I want you to welcome with me to the show, Heather Batten. Heather, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy for the opportunity to be here and talk with you and your listeners. And also, feeling nervous and the importance of the moment that we're in together, and hoping that what I can bring and offer connects with your listeners, like you said, on a heart-to-heart level.
I know that it will. I'm confident of that. And I want to give a shout out right here to Christina, our mutual friend who introduced us. And, I have to tell you, she said so many great things about you. And what struck me about what she said was that you had a certain point of view and a certain calling in the arena of racial justice, if I could call it that. And I was drawn to that because I'm always drawn to people who are fighting to stay in their purpose. And that's something that, we're going to talk about what you do. But I want to just thank Christina. I'm sure she'll be listening. And I am so honored that you would be with us. So let's start, Heather, with your background quickly of how you got into this. What is your life's mission? Kind of educate the listeners on what it is that you do.
Sure. So I have a few identities and roles. I have a online community called The Growing Edge, where I show up as a coach, a consultant, and use my background as a therapist and a community organizer with the goal of providing healing space to explore privilege and power and trauma, and creating really a world, envisioning a world where there is heart-centered equity. So my educational background a little bit is that I went to Bucknell University thinking I was going to study biology and religion, and I ended up with those degrees. But the experience that I got there around racial justice really was kind of what planted the seed for where I am today. And then I became a social worker, really looking for more information around racial justice. And then I've worked for the last 19 years working with children and families in child welfare and learning a lot about complex and developmental trauma.
Wow, that's a lot. And just so the audience knows, you're actually a white woman married to a black man. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so you come at this with an interesting point of view. And when I read your background, you were drawn to social justice issues as a child. Did you feel that calling when you were really young?
Yeah, so I think it's true of a lot of people, and it ends up being quieted. But I have distinct memories of being in like preschool and kindergarten. And I grew up in a predominantly white community, but there was children of color who I remember an emotional experience of, wait, they're being treated differently, and
Mm.
saying something about it. But it wasn't something that then I really had the language or the education or the support to know what to do with that. But it was obviously, now that I'm 40 something years old and still remember that experience, it was profound. And I think that I'm not the only one, right? That's, those of us that are parents, we know our children are very sensitive to when people aren't treated fairly, when they're not being treated fairly.
Yeah. There's a pureness about that. I think our children, before they develop mindsets that are limiting, there's a purity there where they I see that in my children, where they tend to point out things that aren't right, and they have a sensitivity to it. I know I did as well. I remember that on the playground, but I think in your case it became a calling.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, it wasn't really something that I realized was a calling maybe until college. But I think, it's also like, as I've reflected a lot on more recently, like my life experience, I think it became a calling because I noticed growing up there was an experience of being like left out or ostracized that
Mm-hmm.
was like a thread that ran through my life that was really, really powerful. And so when I went to college, that this was something that was happening to the Black people around me, I was like, wait a minute, I identify with that on an emotional level, and I know that it's not right.
Right. You had an
Yeah,
empathy. You had developed, to the degree that you could from your own experience. You had a sense of empathy towards that.
right.
So one thing I want to, kind of set the stage for, and the work I do is in mindset, and everybody that listens and follows knows that that's my focus. And when we look at our mindset, we've got the subconscious and the conscious aspects of it. And I think what we want to do today, and what we always want to do when we're addressing difficult subjects or we're trying to identify limiting beliefs, is we want to take things out of the subconscious, because we cannot change an idea, a belief, a stronghold. We can't change it until we bring it into the conscious mind. And the only way to do that is to focus on it, to talk about it, to allow it to live there long enough where we then start to deal with it. And I know that right now some people feel uncomfortable, and there's been so much emotion tied to all this, but I think that we have to recognize that we want to bring these ideas and the things that Heather, that you're going to talk about, and the things that we're going to address. We want them to stay in the conscious mind. I want to put that out there as one thing. And the second thing I want to put out there for everyone listening is that, truly, and everyone knows that I'm a spiritual person, our enemy is not each other. It never has been. It's never the case. I believe that with all my heart, that we don't fight flesh and blood. We fight spirits and ideas and strongholds behind all of that. But of course, it looks like on the surface we're fighting each other. So, the enemy is not each other. And so this is why we need to have this conversation. We need to identify where these things are coming from and have some sense of revelation, if you will, as to how we can each participate in making this better. So talk to me about when you got to college, how this all started to gel for you. What was it that made you want to focus more and more on this area?
Yeah, so I think it was my junior year. There was friends of mine, Black men who were freshmen, who ended up being accused of all sorts of crimes on campus. And that was not something that I had known them to do. And it escalated very quickly, where they were being held in county jail.
Wow.
And so I very quickly, with like friends of mine and other students of color, we were organizing, kind of like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Right.
And found out that the charges that they were being accused of, there was really no evidence to support it. So there was a lot of activism that happened around that. And this was like in the late 90s. So not something that, now we see that this conversation is a lot more common. It's happening on college campuses all over the place. It wasn't really happening, at least to my knowledge at that time, especially on where I was at Bucknell, which is a predominantly white campus.
Right.
So that just connected for me to the experiences that I had as a child. Like, wait a minute, this is not, how can this be happening?
Right.
not how I thought that people are treated. I was raised that, people are treated fairly, and this can't be true. Like, I know these people, and I know that this is not the things that they've done.
Right. And so were there pockets of racism? And actually, before I ask that, from your point of view, it may seem like a silly question, but define racism for us.
Okay, so I think this is one of the things that I've learned is a major challenge in our conversation around talking about this topic is how we define it.
Mm.
So the training that I had with the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond, they're out of New Orleans, and a anti-racist organization run by people of color. And this year is their 40th year anniversary. They give a training, which one of the things they do is walk people through the definition of racism. And it's a whole process that they have that is really, really profound and has really been helpful to me in having this conversation, because I think we can get really caught up in the definition. And so some people are talking about like individual acts of meanness. And then a lot of times, people are talking about this system that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, when I'm saying racism, I'm talking about systemic racism and the prejudice that benefits white people and combined with the systemic power that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what we're talking about when we're saying racism. And so lots of people can have prejudice and can have, so preconceived ideas. Lots of people can be bigots and not like a group of people.
Right.
And that can happen with any group of people. But when we're talking about racism, it's really talking about a system that is set up to benefit white people. And that's, you can tie that back to historically how that was codified into law.
Right. And then we would see throughout time different, it got worse at certain times and better at certain times, or perhaps it's always there and it just doesn't rear its ugly head. When you were in college, you started to sense that what was happening to your friends was racism, right? That you were sensing that was what was in play when they were being accused of something that they clearly didn't do.
Right. Correct.
So people were assuming that they did because of their color.
Right. And then the charges and the way that the whole system starts to work. So really when we're talking about systemic racism, it's how these systems come together to interact with each other. So we had, the campus police, plus the county police, plus the university administration, plus the media got involved. Then the student body and the professors. And so all of these different systems
mm-hmm.
interacting with each other with the preconceived knowledge that we have started a whole thing, a whole set of events at play.
Okay, so when you talk about systemic racism, it's different than bigotry or an idea that you don't like a certain group of people. What I'm hearing you say, and I just want to make sure I understand it, is that the systems that we live with, education systems, government systems, police, whatever systems our society has set up, is what you're saying is that we systemically, meaning throughout all of those, we have the existence of racism.
Right. Yes. And so, I think it's important to really tie this into history, and everything that I'm really saying about the definition of racism and systemic racism, I've learned from Black people. And that's important, especially for those of us that are white who are speaking on this as anti-racist. In that this is a knowledge base and teaching that comes out of the history and the work and the advocacy of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So I just, it's important for me to recognize that it's not, these are not my own ideas. This is something that has been taught to me out of the generosity of many mentors.
Right.
And so the history that they have taught me is that at the founding of our country, really, and in the 1600s, you can start to see where race became evident, and that was around the times that there was rebellions of the European indentured servants, and the African slaves,
right,
or enslaved peoples, and so to prevent those groups from overthrowing the elite at the time, there was benefits that were given to the European indentured servants who later became known as white, and not given to the African enslaved people. So to separate and prevent that organizing together. And to me, that was a profound piece of knowledge to kind of see how that perpetuates in that divide and conquer, in that separation that we have, experienced now, almost 500 years later.
So that being, and you and I talked once about how that experience or the trauma of that or whatever, not only does it get handed down generation to generation to the families in terms of the storytelling, right, the oral history, but it can actually epigenetic wise change people's DNA, that the idea and the trauma of what they've experienced. So when we fast forward to today and we have the incidents of George Floyd and what that set off in this nation, is it really about George Floyd? Is it really about that specific situation? How do you answer that?
I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, I think it depends on the person that you talk to who is out there. But I think that this is, to me, from my perspective, it is about this 500-year-old history that our country has, that has been built on the backs of Black people, that many people have been killed, and at many other levels of abuses underneath that people are reacting to. And like you were saying before, that this is a very emotional topic. It's emotional from all sides,
right?
Because we all have this history in our bodies, and
Yes.
and different trigger points and reactive points. And I think it's like you were saying, we have to listen and learn and take that information in cognitively. And what I've learned from the perspective of trauma is that it's very hard to do that when we're in a triggered emotional state. So I think that that's also, we're all reacting off of this emotional state of what our experience and what our ancestors' experience has been, and what we've been taught and what maybe we haven't been taught.
That is so true. I can't even, I don't think I can underscore that enough. I mean, no matter, as you listen to this, no matter what you're thinking, no matter what your past has been or your own experience in your lifetime, I don't think we can underscore enough that history matters in all of this, right? It matters on all sides of the issue. It matters on all sides, because I could tell you, Heather, that people, and I'm sure they've said this to you, I've had people say to me so often, I'm so sick of hearing that term white privilege, white privilege. What does that mean? Does that mean that in order for me to allow someone else to bring someone else up, to allow to bring the Black people up, that I have to come down, I have to give up? That does it mean that what I work so hard for is privilege and they didn't work for it? It's all these definitions, and I'm hearing all this and I'm thinking, I don't think we even really know what that means. And there's fear associated with that. So we see the reaction in the streets and that emotion, but there's a ton of emotion and a ton of reactions behind closed doors throughout this country right now, in every color, in every race.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that I wonder, in your experience, and especially being married to a Black man, I hear people say, I don't see color, and I think on the surface that sounds good. But what does that really mean? I mean, are we supposed to see color in that we honor color? Are we supposed to be colorblind in that it doesn't matter? If I say to you, if you're a Black person, I say, I don't see your color, am I saying your color doesn't matter, and I'm actually disconnecting you from the identity of that? Do I want to be seen as white? Does that matter? What have you experienced with that whole I don't see color thing that people say?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of history that I don't fully understand, how that the colorblind movement kind of took hold. But where it stands today in terms of like the conversations around race and racial justice is that many people feel that then it erases their experience, that is different from someone who may be white, that is not as privileged. And so that part of someone's identity is their racial and ethnic heritage. So when we're saying that I don't see color, it's just, I mean, it's just not true, because we can see, infants at like 6 months old can identify racial differences. So, it's kind of this denial of the reality of what's going on.
Right.
I mean, the other piece of that, I think, is that, and that there's hope in the fact that we can get to a place that we are able to connect in a heart-to-heart way, where everyone has access to all of the things that they need and that they desire and that they want. And like from a spiritual perspective, I believe that, I hope for that, I want that. And I think, maybe some people are coming from that place when they say that.
Right.
But it skips over the pain and the hurt and the abuse that has happened to an entire race of people. And we can't get there unless we really sit with them in their pain and see maybe how we've been impacted by maybe perpetrating that, or being silent about it, or, what part of that is our pain as well.
Right. I want to read something to you because I found this interesting, and it goes towards the challenge where we find ourselves right now, the sense that a lot of people have said, especially white people, that no matter what they say, it's wrong. And of course, social media is it can be so good and so awful at the same time with these situations, right? But I see a lot of white people saying, I don't even want to say anything because no matter what, I get attacked. And a good friend of mine the other day, she said something that was about the black officer that got killed. And she was attacked for saying that. And I thought, wow, we're in such a situation where it's hard to know what to say. So do we say nothing? Let me just read to you what someone posted. Being silent means you're not supporting the cause. Speaking up, you're supporting the cause incorrectly. Spreading positivity. The world is not all sunshine and rainbows. Being a realist, why are you so negative? Being for protesting, you're supporting violence. Being against rioting, you're more worried about property than lives. Believing Black Lives Matter, don't you know all lives matter? Believing all lives matter means all lives don't matter right now. And believing Blue Lives Matter, you support corruption. So when you hear that, there's no winning, right? It's like whatever you're saying there's a gotcha, there's a catch. How do we get past that so we can speak to each other? I mean, we've got to be able to talk about this without judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what one of my mentors has said to me recently is, like, when you end up in this like bind where you can't get out of it, that's a sign to know that there's some type of like programming there. Because when you're connected to spirit, to your soul, to God, the next right step is evident. And so that's what I notice is when we get in those conversations that there is a programming that happens. And to me, that programming is the culture. Some people call it American culture, or in racial justice, we'll talk about it as, white American culture. That is this normalized way of that things run that does not get talked about, doesn't really, it's studied more now, but by the majority of us that are white, it's not something that we've really thought about or questioned. And so, and one of those, is around like the perfectionism, which is a difficulty with being wrong. And I know I've struggled with that, and it's paralyzed me in a lot of ways. And also what happens, how we deal with someone when they make a mistake, that it's not that you're not allowed to make a mistake, because if you make a mistake, you are a mistake and you're kind of cast aside. So that, I think, is that emotional response that we're talking about for a lot of people when their heart is there. They want to say something, they want to understand, but then this bind comes up, which is our, cultural programming that gets in the way of that. And so perfectionism is something that's coming up for me as one of them.
So Heather, I'm glad you brought up the perfectionism, because I was going to ask you about that. There's a blog post on your website at thegrowingedge.net, and everybody, if you want to visit her site, there's some good information there, but it talks about how intimidating it is to talk about race for white people. And I think I just gave an example of why. It seems like right now, no matter what somebody says, they're wrong. That's a feeling anyway. But you're kind of talking about how that's rooted in perfectionism, and it's something that we deal with. What is perfectionism from the standpoint of our topic today? What do you mean by that?
I mean, for me, a lot of the work as a anti-racist organizer has been exploring like my own inner self and how this kind of stuff, this like programming shows up for me. So I don't know if I have like a great definition of perfectionism, but I know for me it shows up a lot as not being able to really be myself, to a lot of anxiety in just how I present in the world, and being really self-critical. Sometimes for me it shows up as like procrastinating, that I'm just gonna like put something off and not do it because I can't do it exactly right. I think it's like, for me, it's stifled a lot of my creativity, that I have like all these ideas,
Yeah.
but I don't believe that I can like fully execute them in the way that they are in my mind. So I don't do them.
Right. And so that leads to us staying away from the conversation of race, because if we can't do it right, like people are afraid to have the conversation at all. And so right now I feel like everyone's taking their corners, whatever that looks like. Either you're quiet or you're taking another corner, and people aren't really willing to leave their corners and talk. But I mean, as we record this right now, we still have protests going on. We still have rioting and looting. There is a visceral reaction to that, right? Seeing that violence. How do you process that with the work that you do when you see, now let's not talk about the protesting, let's talk about specifically the violence that is happening. Talk to us about how you see that, how you process that, and how you think about the images of that happening.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it's not something that I really judge, because I don't know what I would be doing if I didn't have access to a system that would listen to me. And so I think that, people's behavior and choices is as a result of things that they have lived. And it's not something for me to judge. It's really something for me to listen to and try to understand why it's happening. And I also, kind of connect to, are there moments in my life where I have been so frustrated and overwhelmed and done something to address that, even as small as, like when we were talking, I said I've like thrown a remote across the room when I've been really, really frustrated.
Right.
And that's small, but it's, like that is the human experience. And so, it has my attention, and the fact that that is something that people are feeling so frustrated and so unheard, that is an action that they're taking. And I know, this is a quote that from Martin Luther King that is going around the internet, that, a riot is a language of the unheard. And so like, what is not being heard? I think that's really important.
So it's almost, I mean, I don't know. I guess if you see a child throwing a tantrum, there's something deeper to it. And so if you're only dealing with the behavior, you're not addressing the root. It's hard. It's hard to, you can probably understand, and I think people listening, some of them, it's hard to say, well, that's okay. It's just hard to say that when we see that kind of thing, because it's scary. But what I hear you saying is that this may be a reaction to a system that doesn't listen to them.
Right. It's not set up to listen to them. I mean, the system is purposely designed to keep all of us in a particular place and keep all of us divided.
So what do we do about that?
I mean, I think for me, right, we have this amazing opportunity as humans, and this is, kind of the call for white people, that there's a lot of this culture that we have been assimilated, or, not even given a choice, that we've been born into, that we're really, disconnected from some of our heart space and our body reactions. And so we have an opportunity to get reacquainted with that and listen. But I think, we're getting a lot of messages of like, what should we be listening to when, and we should speak up, and and that's, maybe we can get into that a little bit more, but I think, really paying attention to the pain and taking that in, and being moved by it.
I think that one of the things that I hear people say is that it's choices. A lot of people focus on choices. Do you believe that choice has anything to do with it? What I mean by that is, so in theory, this is a capitalistic economy, right? So you can make choices. You can make choices to better yourself, to do this, to do that. And the choices that are being made are sort of driving what, your reality is. How do we put that in the context of what's going on right now? And is it as simple as people making choices? Because I can tell you, just sharing what I hear, is people feel frustrated saying, well, there are a lot of people making bad choices, and then they get the consequences of that, and they want everyone else to change it. Is it as simple as choices?
I don't think so. I think, the choices that we make are the best choices that we have based on what is available to us. And so if we have two different worlds, two different societies with different choices, different options available, then it really looks different. And I think, like you said, in terms of capitalism, I think that that's an important point. And that's one of that programming that's in place, that this is the best way for us to function. And I, like, to be honest, I have not studied economics. I don't know, what is a different system that could possibly be, but I know, like, from my heart space, if I'm visioning a world that exists, it doesn't involve one where there's scarcity, where there is people with so much they don't know what to do with it, like billions and trillions of dollars, and that there's people who are hungry and don't have anything. And, my understanding from a historical viewpoint is, capitalism was really created around the same time that slavery was. And one of the first products that was bought and sold in this country were enslaved people. So I think that that's another, like, mindset kind of thing, that we can think about. Is there another way? And, I think if we stay in an intellectual space of, like, there's a lot of argument around that. And I don't have, like, a, economic plan,
Right.
but from a vision, and from my heart, like, what I desire. And I believe that if we can, like, imagine it, that it's possible, that there's another way to function. And so, capitalism hurts my heart. And the fact that this system is set up so that white people have so much more wealth than Black people, there's something that I need to look at deeper there.
When you were a social worker, you said that you did that to try to help, but you felt that you weren't always able to help, or that, I think you even said that maybe sometimes you actually hurt situations. What was that like, that experience for you?
I think it's an experience that a lot of people have when they're working in systems, and it's really, really challenging. I mean, for me, it wasn't something that I could turn off, or maybe I thought that I wasn't turning it off, but sometimes I was. And it's part of, like, being part of a system and having a job. There's procedures and policies that everyone has to follow. And if you don't follow those procedures and policies, then, your supervisor talks to you, you could lose your job, all those kind of things. And I think even if it's just not about race, we all know those experiences,
Right.
Working inside of systems, that if you speak up on something that you think is wrong and the people above you don't agree, you're risking something.
Right.
And so that is really challenging. And I think, for me, it's been challenging, specifically talking about race at work. And on one hand, in social work, sometimes it's a topic that is more acceptable, but still, there is a system in place of, certain things that are acceptable, and this is the way that we do things. And then when that is questioned, it's really hard for people. And I think, as I've grown and matured, my my way of questioning has changed, and maybe, is more effective and more strategic and
Yeah.
not so emotional.
Right.
Because then that, like we were talking about, that triggers other people's emotions. Like, okay, this is what I know about, this is the right way to do things.
Right.
And that's one of those other like programming things that we have, that there is a right way to do things. And, as I've really like explored for myself and explored, this, what I've internalized about racism is that perhaps there's more than one right way to do things, or that the way that we know is the right way. There could be other options.
I hear you say often, I'm just hearing through the thread of what you're saying is to really, you're trying to move more and decide more from heart-based intelligence rather than systems-based structure. And
Yeah.
that structure, it doesn't allow for, many times, us to make decisions that maybe are better or more empathetic or more moral because we run up against these systems. So without dismantling the entire system, maybe the issue out there is how do we begin to look at system by system a way to make it more just from a heart standpoint, right? I mean, when I hear people talking about defund the police, I have to admit that my reaction is like, wait a minute, how does that work? Like it seems like a just one example of an extreme way of dismantling a system. And is that system totally broken? Is that system partially broken? Anytime we can create a system, but we put people in it, people are broken. I mean, we're just imperfect. We don't always make good decisions. We're not always kind. We're not always. I mean, there's a lot there that any system will have broken people. But when you hear those kind of things, I mean, and I'm just curious. Just be honest with your own mindset. Do you feel like it's as deep as dismantling big systems like that?
I do. In a lot of ways, because I think of the way that they were founded. But I'm with you in saying, like, I don't know what that could possibly look like, because this is where I grew up. This is what I was conditioned to. So I'm, very used to like how the police operate, how they operate in my life, which is very different than how they, operate in the relationship that my husband has with them.
Mm.
And so, I mean, this is one of these things that I think that instead of, shutting down, we can open up to the leadership that Black people are taking around, the way that they would envision that. Because there are, a lot of people talking about, we can, create systems where the police aren't necessary. And it's not meaning about those individual people, right? Even when we're talking about that, it's not about having hate for those individuals. It is the system. And there is some conditioning that happens to people in those systems that they then internalize. But in terms of the system and the history of it really evolving out of slave patrols, it can be traced back to that. I think that we really need to examine that. And is there another way that we can envision keeping each other safe? I mean, and that's a big vision, but I think that it's possible, but not in one where we're leaving people behind as well. And that's something that I've gotten a lot from the People's Institute. Ron Chisholm is one of the co-founders, and in multiple workshops and all my work with him, and he's always like, we're not leaving people behind. And I think that comes up as well, because we're used to a really competitive way of interacting with each other. And you were saying this before, that, if I give this up for someone else to get it, that means I don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
And that is another way that we're conditioned to think about things. And I've questioned, is that really how it needs to be? Or is there another way? Is there enough for everyone really? And we've just been kind of fooled into thinking that we're in competition with each other.
Well, I think that's one of the core things, because it's the lie of scarcity, which means if I have more, you have less, right? Or
Right.
if I have to give you something, that means I have to give up. I think, what as moral people, we want all ships to rise together. And what does that look like? But the vitriol out there and the screaming at each other is so loud, it's hard to find where that ground is. And can we come to a point where we say, let's bring everybody up. What does that look like? Because I don't believe in scarcity. I think scarcity is a lie. I think people experience it. Trust me, they experience it. But
Right.
I think it's a lie, and it's a limiting belief, and it's something that not only would one person believe that they don't have to believe, but it's also something someone can put upon someone else. But it's a trap, and it's a lie, and it's not true. And there is not a true situation, even spiritually, that if you have more, I have less. But that shuts down, just from my standpoint, that shuts down the conversations, that feeling that, okay, so you want me to give up something so you can have more. And what have you done to get that, right? We get to that competitiveness.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that gets very uncomfortable. And I can even feel right now as I talk about it, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think, and guys, as you're listening to all of this, I know everyone's not going to agree with what I'm saying or what Heather's saying. This isn't about, but I've always said to everybody, when you start to feel uncomfortable, just examine it and just look at it, because we like to just put it away when we feel uncomfortable, right? Because we don't want to deal with it. But that's where the growth is. And when you don't have the answers, it's even harder to stay in that space. But if we're willing to just embrace it long enough to talk about it, I would think that this is what you have to do, right? You as a coach, and doing all, you have to bring these uncomfortable conversations to people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I relate to what you're saying about competition. I mean, my many experiences of feeling competitive, goes back to being a child and being in school, and, how that was socialized into me, from a very early age. And even, watching, I have a 7-year-old, and in first grade, some of the stuff that they're doing in school online now. And it's not, the teacher does not mean anything by it. It's just, the stuff that she is taking from lessons plans, but it creates this competitive environment among the 7-year-olds. And they don't, they're just going along with it and don't know any better. But I can sense in my daughter what that brings up for her. And, it's really, I think what we're used to is, like you're saying, to not go there, to not feel that stuff, to avoid it, to deny it, to pretend that everything is okay, because it's not always been safe. At least, in my experience, it's not been safe to be in my heart all of the time,
Yeah.
or to show that, because, what the world out there is competitive. People are experiencing scarcity. They're scared. They're afraid. So I'm putting my heart out there. This is what I think. And, someone else's issues come up and stomp all over it. And I haven't had anything to prepare me for that.
Yeah. And I do think too, it's interesting, as I wonder sometimes people's own experience, whether or not are they intentionally racist, or are they just reacting from their experience? What I mean by that is, there are plenty of people who have had repeated negative experiences with someone, right? And whether that be teachers in their life, bosses, but let's take it to race. If you have a repeated negative experience with someone of the other race, are you racist because your reaction is immediate when you interact with that person, or is it based on repeated experiences? And how do we challenge that? If I have a bad experience with a bunch of white people, I'm not now avoiding white people, but you understand that people have like a repeated, I've heard it so much in my life, well, this happened to me several times with a black person, so now my reaction is X, Y, and Z to black people because that's all I've known, right? And vice versa. Certainly, right? If a black person has had repeated and negative experiences with a white person. So are we racist for that, or we just need to be challenging our experiences? That's another touchy area.
Yeah. I mean, I think what comes up for me, what I'm thinking about when you're saying that is also how in many, many parts of this country, I know in New Jersey, our communities are so segregated, and there's a history behind why that is as well. If someone wants to explore that more, they can, look up redlining. But we don't have those day-to-day relationships cross-racially for the large part, because our communities are so separated. So, a few experiences with a black person for a white person, I would wonder, how that's really painting a larger picture.
Right.
Um, and what the experiences or the knowledge that we do get about Black people is largely given to us from the media, which is an entire other system,
Mm.
that we know, today, much more than even, 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, that this is a very biased system that is, painting a particular
Yeah.
picture for us to get, a reaction, to get a message. So that is the exposure that we have, as white people of Black people in our lives, from early on.
Right.
And it ends because we're not interacting in communities, in churches, in schools together. And so, many times, when that does happen, there's a different understanding that
Yeah.
people have when you're able to find places to connect on a human level.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think you bring up a good point with the media. And especially now, I think we're just all struggling with that. What is the truth of what's going on? Because it's hard to find truth, right? And we've got to find truth, everybody. We've got to find the truth. I mean, this is what we should spend our life doing about ourselves, about others, because we're making decisions from things that just aren't true. And we want to embrace what God made us. I mean, I want to be okay with being white. Let me just be honest with you. I want to be okay. I don't want to feel guilty about that. And I want my girlfriend to be okay with being Black and not feel less than because of that. Why does one race need to be brought down to bring up another? These are the things that come up in my mind. And I wonder, how long is it going to take us to get to that point? And, what is it that we have to do so that we can look at each other and just see, a child of God, and you're Black, I'm white, you're brown. It's great. Why does it matter? It goes back so far, and it feels, like you said, so systemic, and we don't have the answers. But if you could do anything right now, it's a big question. If you could do anything right now with everything that's happening out there, I'm going to give you the magic wand, you're in charge. What kind of steps would you take? What would you do in a perfect situation?
I mean, I think, the everyone is at a different point in learning, so I think, being really honest with yourself about what you might not know, but coming from a perspective of someone, this is like who is waking up like, oh my gosh, this is something that is an issue. I want to do more, or I want to explore this. I mean, I think the first thing is really listening to Black folks. And there's a lot of, stuff on the internet. There's a lot of books out there on anti-racism, and, doing some reading, listening more and gathering that information as to what they're talking about. That's really important. And I think the other piece is having, for those of us that are white, like having conversations with each other. And really questioning this programming, this culture that we have that doesn't get talked about, that isn't taught. Some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, like the perfectionism and competition and capitalism and the denial, those kind of behaviors, and where does that like reside in our culture, and having those conversations. But for the call really for white people in this work is to talk to other white people. And I think the instinct is like, when we're doing the learning, for a lot of people, is to go to Black leaders and ask them, a
Right.
million trillion questions. And so, and it's a weird, even, I have to be honest, like the past, maybe this weekend or the weekend before, I really was like sitting with all of this. And this, this is the conversations I've been having for like 20 years. And I had to like sit back and like, just be like, I'm not even really sure right now, like where I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be saying, how I'm supposed to, serve what I feel is my mission. And I had to get really honest that, some of the things that I might be saying are gonna upset people, even, the Black people that I organize with. And, because everyone is struggling with their own piece of this, and really, being clear on what is my mission, and where do I want to serve. And also that like people might not like it, and what do I need to take care of myself in order to sustain that and, stay in relationship and in conversation with them.
Yeah. Yeah. So you yourself, having been in this work for so long, you're also struggling, right?
Yeah.
With the way to approach this. I appreciate your being honest about that. And it feels really welcoming to be able to be transparent with someone who has been fighting this fight, and just to say, I don't know, but these are the things that are coming up. And I think what you do, Heather, we need more of. I don't think that any of us think that we really have the answer, but somewhere in there is something that we can do, and we must do something. And I don't have it, you don't have it, but you definitely have a gifting and a calling, and I want to honor that in you. And I'm wondering if people want more of what you do, are you available to go speak to groups? Can they get in touch with you to delve more into this? And are you still coaching and all of that?
Yeah, so I do individual coaching, and they can find me on my website at thegrowingedge.net. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at The Growing Edge. I do some trainings, and also, I can help direct to some resources and organizers, Black organizers who have a lot of resources. So yeah, and I'm hoping to sometime in the next 6 months or so work on a course really to explore this programming a little bit more around white culture and connect with people, because I think that that's something that if I really like check in with myself, I've been missing my entire life, is that like heart to heart connection. So I've been exploring like what has been preventing that, and this programming is some of the stuff that has been coming up. So I'm hoping to offer that as well for people who want to delve into that a little bit more.
And I think if we can find safe spaces, I hate that word normally, but I'm going to use it here because we have to be able to ask questions and not be attacked, right? Because if we don't ask those questions, then we don't have a chance to change our mindset. And so asking questions, sharing experiences, and listening will give us the opportunity to change our mindset. And right now, I'm not seeing a lot of space for that. So I'm hoping that people like you and others that do what you do, that you will be able to create those spaces where people can ask questions. I myself wasn't even going to speak to this per se, but when I heard about you and I thought, I want to talk about this to the degree that we all have limiting mindsets, all of us. No one can say they don't in this arena, no matter what. I don't want to use the word side, but no matter what, part of the argument you're on or part of the experience you're on, is we definitely have limiting mindsets, and we're definitely not doing this right, or we wouldn't be seeing this level of pain out there. So we know something's broken. It's not that hard to see that. But my prayer is that we all start to figure this out, and that a year from now we can say we've actually made progress instead of just moved on to the next crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed.
Thank you, Heather, so much. I know we're going to be talking in the future more about your life and some things coming up in a special thing that we're doing in July. So we will talk then, but I appreciate you, and I hope people get a chance to check out what you do. I thank you for being transparent and honest and just helping us understand better what's going on out there. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this and it made you a little uncomfortable, I guess is my wish, because that's how we grow. And that's how we change in our lives. And we definitely all need to be part of the solution. So I hope that you guys will think about some of the things that have been said. And we will see you guys online and talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to Master Your Mindset Radio. Before you go, if you want to be part of a free online community of like-minded individuals for support, resources, and inspiration as you conquer your limiting beliefs and pursue your purpose, go to elizabethnader.com/community. That's elizabethnader.com/community, or search for Master Your Mindset Academy private group on Facebook. Looking forward to seeing you online.